Today we are joined by Nathan Morelli, ICT Assurance Manager at the Department of Education. Welcome, Nathan.
Thanks for having me.
Pleasure. Maybe we could start by you giving us a bit of very brief background of your role in the ICT assurance area.
Yeah, so our team's role is to help the Department for Education and Child Development manage ICT-related risk. So that's risk for both our corporate teams and for our schools and our preschool teams as well.
Following your risk workshops, you've got to go away, have a look at these risks, and then get into the process of actually assigning likelihood and consequence to these risks, and in terms of building a risk assessment matrix. So perhaps you can share the experience of how you go about that within your projects.
So from one of those workshops, we'll then take that away as a risk as the team that will lead the documentation of the risk. So that's one of our key roles in that process, is to document what was said in those workshops, work out the difference between what people were talking about, whether that was actually a risk treatment that they were talking about rather than a strategy, or whether they were talking about a potential control. It's just about getting their language and what they were interpreting into the right parts of the risk methodology. So you might have people who get confused in between, well, that is probably a cause rather than a risk. So we kind of take that and we document it. And when you've got a workshop that's got a lot of information in it, you usually come out with 4 or 5 key risks.
Yes.
But it doesn't feel that way in the workshop. Everybody feels like they identified 3,000 risks. But you're really probably going to talk about 4 or 5 key areas. And that's really our first step, is to kind of summarise, make sure that we've got the risks well documented, well outlined. We know our causes and our potential impacts from that.
Yeah. And
then we can move on to the rest of our risk assessment process.
Right. So what's important that I've picked up from what you've just said, and we have reiterated that to our students in this course, is not just to come up with what we think a risk is, but to state it in terms of cause and effect. And it sounds to me like that's what you guys do, to sift through and to tidy up what essentially the key risks are. What was also interesting for me to hear was you saying that in the session some people come up and talk about what we refer to as gross risk, and others of residual risk, because they're aware of certain controls that have been put into place. So you're basically giving some shape to the whole thing to make sure we get into risk identification first, then the risk assessment, looking at likelihood and impact, and in a structured manner then move on to risk response.